Hi everyone, this is Kalyan Kumar and welcome once again to Chemistry Universe. Now, though I promised in my last video that we will be only looking at the optical isomers till that video and that will begin conformational isomers, but after I went through the entire curriculum once again, there were a few gaps that I had left and I want to fill that up in this last video of optical isomerism. And I promise after that, optical isomerism is not going to be done. We'll be doing conformational isomers after that. So this is the last part of optical isomers. And this is part 11 of the isomerism series. I really don't know how many videos are yet to be made. It'll keep on going as I keep reviewing it, because once I fix it in the beginning, then it becomes a little cumbersome if I feel that I need to add a little bit more. So we'll keep it open-ended for now. So anyway, so let's start with the part 11. And in this one, we will look at various methods of resolution. If you remember, we talked about resolution as the technique by which we separate enantiomers. And since we began that, since we talked about that, we haven't really discussed how is that resolution done. And we also, and in fact, I had also mentioned a drug thalidomide in which one enantiomer had one effect. It was able to control the puking tendency of pregnant women in the morning sickness, while the other was able to bring about deformities in the newly born children. So it was very essential in that case to make sure that the drug thalidomide had to be separated into its component enantiomers. So you couldn't package them as, the racemic mixture. That being one point. The second is, how do we do that? How do we do this resolution? That's the first thing that we will cover. The second thing that we'll cover is, we'll look at various formulae that will help you make your calculations easier when it comes to dealing with calculating the number of stereoisomers. Again, remember, we have two options. One is we draw the stereoisomers and check the number. The other is we use the formulae. And you might want to know which is the best, because sometimes the formulas may also be a little cumbersome. They may be a little complicated, or not complicated, but a little longer to learn. And so you might ask the question, should we learn the formula or should we simply make it by logic? Well, logic is always important to know. Doing anything by the first principle is very, very important. But the fact that you are appearing in an exam, if it were not for an exam, if you were just learning it for the sake of learning it, then I would say there is no point in learning formulas. Simply go ahead and draw all the structures, and that will in fact make your thinking better. But since you're giving an exam, there's a time limit. And sometimes you might have to calculate the number of stereoisomers or the number of optical isomers in a given species. And that could be a problem if you don't know the formula, because you will have to draw them and sometimes they'll be complicated. You might miss out something. So it is better to know both. The best deal is to know both. Know all the formulae, remember them, revise them, use them in doing questions. At the same time, know how to draw them if required by the first principle. What happens in an exam if you are in a hurry and you're a bit psyched up and you just can't remember whether it's n by 2 or n minus 1 by 2, you really don't know what it was. In that case, the first principle will help you. So let's get on with it. And this is part 11, methods of separation and calculation of stereoisomers. So here we go. So let's start with methods of resolution. Now, separation of enantiomers from a mixture is called resolution. This we already talked about. And since enantiomers have the same boiling point, melting point, refractive index, solubility in chiral solvents, it is not possible to separate them by conventional methods like fractional distillation. In fact, fractional distillation is one of the best methods of separating compounds with very close boiling points. But the fact of the matter is that enantiomers have exactly equal boiling point. So there is no way you can use fractional distillation, which is why we have to resort to an expensive method. Expensive mainly because the amount of sample that you will use and the amount of products eventually you'll get, there'll be a stark difference between the percentage yield, because these are not that easy methods, and therefore the yield being low, you have to use a large amount of sample size, and the process is also very technical, very highly skilled. So you have to employ, in a industry, you need to employ very high paying chemical engineers to do this effectively, which is why the cost of making or separating enantiomers, pure enantiomers, is pretty tough and expensive. Generally, there are two ways of doing resolution. So there are two ways of doing it. One is called chromatography, or more technically called chiral chromatography. So let's understand what is chiral chromatography. For that matter, let's understand what is chromatography as an analytical technique. Now, chromatography is an analytical technique commonly used for separating a mixture of chemical substances into its individual components, so that the individual components can be analyzed or identified in a lab or separated for isolation in industries. A big paragraph. What does it mean? Simple. This technique, when used in a lab, is used to identify, to analyze the components of a mixture, to know what components exist in a mixture, and in an industry they are meant to separate the enantiomers and get a certain amount of yield for both enantiomers. So in the lab, we are not trying to separate them in terms of getting them and using them further. In a lab, we are given a mixture, we want to know what it contains. And chromatography is one technique that does that. And there is another type of chromatography which helps you, which is done in industry, which helps you separate them and isolate them. You can isolate them, you can get them, and then you can use them further for making various type of compounds. So let's understand this with the help of an actual chromatography that is being done to analyze the various components that exist in a wet black marker. You have seen markers. There are two types of markers. There are the wet markers and the dry markers. And the reason we use wet marker in this experiment is mainly because wet markers are water soluble. So wet markers are the ones which were used in early days of markers, where you would write on the whiteboard and then you would take something which is wet, a wet cloth, and rub them off. So they were water soluble. The dry markers that we get these days, they are water insoluble. For them, we use different kind of other solvents. Technique is the same. Here, I'm going to use solvent as water. So we need to understand what this basically, this process entails. Now, in chromatography, I'm going to show you in a short while, but I'll just give you a brief idea what it is. Chromatography is a technique in which you have two phases. One is a stationary phase, one is a moving phase. Stationary phase could be paper, filter paper, and a special type of filter paper called the Whatman filter paper number 1. Now, the moving phase in the present experiment that I will show is water. So what we do is we draw a line on the paper with the marker. We could have as well have put a drop in it. The reason we are drawing a line here is because we want to get a broader spectrum of, we want the entire paper to be covered with the various pigments that make up that black ink. If I put just a spot, then it will be just a small smudge on the paper. We want the entire paper to be smudged to see it clearly. So we draw a horizontal line. There is water kept. We keep the filter paper on, or rather in the water, such that the marker is above the water surface, but the portion below the that line drawn with the marker is dipped into water. Now water will automatically rise up in the filter paper due to capillary action. As it does, it will pass through the line drawn with the marker. So basically, it is going to pass through the marker. It is water soluble, so it will dissolve in water. Now, all pigments making up the black ink will dissolve in water. They are all water soluble. But if assuming black marker is made up of, let's say, 4 or 5 types of pigment, then each pigment, depending on its chemical composition, has different amount of solubility in water. It will also have different amount of adsorbability on the filter paper. So this is the game between adsorption and dissolution or solubility. It is solubility versus adsorption. Solubility in water, adsorption in the filter paper. So as the water along with the pigment moves up the water, one pigment which is less soluble in water and let us say more adsorbable on the filter paper will start getting adsorbed on the filter paper, while the other pigments which may be more soluble in water than adsorbable on the filter paper will continue to move with the water. So that pigment which has low solubility in water and high adsorbability in the filter paper will get stuck on the filter paper first. Then comes the one whose solubility in water is next, lower. Lowest first, then the next lower, then the next lower, and eventually all pigments are able to separate out on the filter paper. So you will be able to see, now in this particular case, since it is visible, they will all be visible dyes. So you will see various colors. In case the black pigment of a wet marker is made up of various other pigments. But if these dyes are single component, it's only black, then you will get only one smudge and you will be able to see that. So that way you will be able to know. There are cases where in the case of its amino acids or stuff, where they will not have any color on their own. They will be colorless. So if they are colorless, what will happen is after a long time, after the solvent has risen to as high as it can go, you spray it with certain chemicals which will react with those components adsorbed on the filter paper to give different colors. So let's say I have 2 amino acids and using this paper chromatography, they have been separated, but I'm not able to see it, they are colorless. I spray them with a compound that reacts with both to give different colors, and I'll see different smudges after having sprayed them with that kind of a chemical compound. So let's have a look at a video where we demonstrate how the black ink of a wet marker is separated into its constituent pigments using chromatography. And this chromatography that I'm showing you is paper chromatography. So here we go. So paper chromatography in the lab. And the goal of this experiment is to separate the different pigments of ink of this marker. And the marker is this. It's a wet erase marker. It can be erased with water. And this is the filter paper. We have drawn a line with the marker. And now we're going to place this in a glass containing the water. And as you can see, water is rising up along with the pigment. Now it will not move this fast. It is 16x playback speed that you're seeing right now. And that is why you see it going so fast. Otherwise it will take a very long time. So 16x speed is going up, and can you see the various colors? I see the yellow, I see the reddish tinge, I see the bluish tinge, and the blue is also made up of some light blues in it, some dark pigments in it. And eventually it will separate out into all possible pigments it is made up of. Right now at least I can see 3 or 4 of them. A detailed analysis of course will give us more ideas about how many pigments are there. And this is how the paper chromatography works. And as I mentioned, in the chromatography, there is a stationary phase, which is the paper, and a movable phase, which is in this case water. Now, the difference between this of course was not a chiral chromatography, it was a normal general chromatography. So in a chiral chromatography, the mixture to be separated are a pair of enantiomers, and at least one of the phases, that is the moving or the stationary, are chiral compounds. And there are 2 ways of doing it. One is something which I've already shown you, paper. The other is called column chromatography. Now, paper chromatography is meant for identification only. We just want to know which pigments are there. We saw yellow, we saw red. But I cannot separate the yellow now. In a paper chromatography, you can only identify the pigments. You cannot separate them. Now, I only want the yellow, but sorry, the yellow is already adsorbed on the paper. How do you take it out? But in a column chromatography, you can separate them. So one is identification, one is separation and isolation. So the column chromatography is the one where we can do separation and isolation, which is carried out in industry. So the first one, paper chromatography, we've already seen this. Now in this, the sample is dissolved in an achiral solvent, while the paper is coated with a pure chiral compound which can only bind or adsorb one enantiomer. The important thing being that the solvent in a paper chiral chromatography or chiral paper chromatography, the solvent will be achiral so that it can dissolve both. So you put a drop, you put a point on the filter paper, which is a mixture, racemic mixture. And it contains both enantiomers. And in a racemic mixture, they are in equal amount. And now what you do is the solvent is achiral, so it will dissolve both. But the paper will be coated with some kind of a pure chiral compound that can bind more to one of the enantiomers that need to be separated out. So let's say I have got enantiomer A and B in the mixture. I need to separate it. I coat the paper with a pure compound, a chiral pure compound C. And let us say A binds with C better than B does, or A binds with C, B doesn't bind at all. So when I separate it, so when the chromatography is happening, A will bind faster on C, so you will find the smudge of A first, and then after some time, the B will get smudged if it binds a little less. So they travel with different velocities depending on their solubility in the solvent as well as their ability to get adsorbed. Now, right now, the solubility in the solvent will be same because they are enantiomers and the solvent is achiral. But their adsorbing tendency on the filter paper will be different because we have created the filter paper in such a way it can bind to one more than the other. So A gets adsorbed first, so you will get the smudge of A, and after that you will get the smudge of B. You can identify the enantiomers now. As the solvent containing the sample rises due to capillary reaction, the enantiomer that binds with the pure chiral compound coating the stationary phase starts to get attached to the filter paper first, while the non-reactive enantiomer continues to rise up with the solvent. And if it is also going to bind with the chiral compound of the paper, it will get adsorbed a little later. Next comes column chromatography. Now this is the case where we separate them. This is the industrial process. So this is an animation that we are showing. So column chromatography. And now what you're seeing right now is of course a horizontal pipe, but it is actually a vertical tube. This is a mixture of some chiral compounds. And you can assume that these are two enantiomers, but it could be as many as you want. And the tube is initially filled with some kind of a stationary phase, which is a silica gel or something. And here the stationary phase is achiral, the solvent, the moving phase is chiral. So one dissolves more in the moving phase, the red separates out, and then there is a beaker that make the red fall down, and then yellow separates out. Then let's move the truck, get the blue in, and we're able to separate the constituent. Here you can assume that it is two enantiomers being separated. And remember, it's held vertically, and the movement of the solvent and these are basically based on gravity. So they all move from top to bottom, and we are able to separate these. And in column chromatography, either the stationary phase or the mobile phase is chiral. You can keep either one of them as chiral. The next one is the second way of separating the enantiomers is diastereomeric conversion and separation. And now this is actually a much better technique. But of course, it involves several steps, and then remember, more the steps involved in any separation method, greater is the problem in trying to, the greater would be the loss of compound, or poorer would be the percentage yield. Here, what we do is we treat both enantiomers or a mixture of enantiomers with a pure chiral compound C. Let's assume both enantiomers are A and B. We treat it with a pure chiral compound C. A and C, B and C combine. Let's assume both of them combine, or maybe even one could combine, and then that would combine and B would anyway be separated out. But let's assume both combine. But C is pure chiral. A is pure chiral, B is pure chiral, but A and B are in a mixture. So A reacts with C to give D, B reacts with C to give E. D and E would be diastereomers, and I'll show you how. And since they'll be diastereomers, it is easier to separate them because they will have different boiling points. And fractal distillation is going to be very helpful there. So let's check this out. So the enantiomers are treated with a pure chiral compound. Assuming both enantiomers react with a compound, they will give two different products which will be diastereomers of each other. So let's take an example. I take a carboxylic acid, R form, and its enantiomer, S form. Just look at the right and the left. Here the right left and here the right left have interchanged. So this is R, this is S. So now I treat them with an optically active alcohol. And if you remember, acid and alcohol, they give rise to ester. Now remember, this alcohol is the R form. I'm using a pure optically active compound. Now the R acid and the R alcohol will give you an ester which will have two chiral carbons. One chiral carbon due to this, one chiral carbon due to this. And remember, the chirality, the configuration of these two carbons will remain same even after reaction. You can check it out using CIP rules. And the ester that I get will be RR ester. Both chiral carbons are R. Whereas if I use it with the S1, now here I'm going to portray the S1 in a different way. I'm going to switch these two, right and left, and I'm going to switch these two. So that will keep the configuration same because even interchanges will keep the configuration same. So now in the product I'll get S carbon here, but this will remain as R. So the product I get, just check, I've switched the COH with H. Then I've also switched C2H5 and CH3 to keep the configuration same. So this chiral carbon is S, whereas this chiral carbon is R. So they are diastereomers because remember, if all configurations invert, it is enantiomer. If some invert, it is diastereomer. And we know that diastereomers can be separated by many physical methods like fractional distillation. So that was how you can separate and isolate and identify a mixture of chiral compounds, especially enantiomers. So now let's look at some of the methods, formulae especially, of calculating stereoisomers. Now remember, stereoisomers can be due to geometrical as well as optical. So first we will assume that if all the stereoisomers are unsymmetrical, that means there is no symmetry anywhere, then the total number of stereoisomers that uses GI as well as optical, GI is geometrical isomers and optical, is 2 to the power n, where n is the number of geometrical centers plus number of optical centers. Let's take an example. Now, which kind of stereoisomerism can this show? Obviously not GI. So it will show optical because the carbon is chiral. So, and how many optical centers does it have? How many chiral centers does it have? It has one chiral center. So n is 1. So if I apply this formula, what will I get? 2. This is one chiral center and 2 to the power 1, 2. Now there may be cases where there is a bond about which geometrical isomers are possible, and the ends of the bonds are such that optical isomers are possible there, then we treat them as optical isomers. I'll explain this with an example. Take this example. Now, can you see here in this double bond I can have geometrical? Whereas this carbon is chiral, optical. So optical is pink and blue is geometrical, okay? So this is geometrical, optical, and there is no geometrical here. But you could also notice that around a single bond of a small ring, geometrical is also possible. Now, around this bond, geometrical is possible because these two both could be up or this could be down. And so they could be both up or one up and one down. So even geometrical is possible. So if geometrical is also possible, optical is also possible around this bond, use them as optical because that will give you more isomers. So there are one geometrical center, two optical center, n is 3, 2 to the power 3, 8. How about this one? How many chiral, and you will notice no symmetry anywhere. There are 2 chiral centers, 2 to the power 2. And if you want, you can draw all of them and check. Try this one. Now I want you to find out, pause the video, find out, and then play it back. Now it has got one geometrical center at the double bond and one chiral center at the carbon here. This is optical center, this is geometrical center. Again 2 to the power 2, 4. How about this one? Obviously a geometrical center here. But remember, this is an optical center. There is no geometrical center here. It's an optical center. It's an alene. Can you see? Alene with 2 double bonds and the terminal carbons having different groups. So you will have optical center and a geometrical center. 2 of them. So N is 2. How about this one? Now I want you to pause the video again. Do it and play it back. So geometrical center here, optical center here, 4 groups are different, optical center here, so that makes it 3. No, there's one more optical center here. Do you notice the biphenyl, substituted biphenyl at ortho positions with giant groups? So when you have substituted biphenyls with ortho substituted giant groups, it will also show optical isomers because they will be in different planes. So it will also create an optical activity here. Due to this, no symmetry, and therefore you have 4 of them. And drawing them would have been much more difficult. Formulae makes it easier to calculate. Point out the geometrical and optical centers. Optical, that's because there is one H, sp3 carbon and 4 groups. This is also optical center, chiral center. Geometrically is possible in this double bond as well as this double bond. So there are 5 of them. And it would have been virtually impossible to, try to figure this out. If you were to put R and cis, R, S and cis and trans, it would have taken you need to get 32 values, and to get that it's going to be pretty tough. So if you look at this one, there is no geometrical here because this is CH2. Now there can be geometrical here, there can be geometrical here, there can be geometrical in between all the 3, but they are also optical centers. We'll count them as optical. So optical center, chiral centers, 3. So that makes it 8. So now let's go and check out optical isomers specifically. So the first case we are doing is case 1 where there is no symmetry in any configurational stereoisomer. So the total number of optical isomers here. Now this is what you need to understand. When I say total number of optical isomers, it means any stereoisomer that is stereoisomeric with an optically active compound. So if you want to calculate total number of optical isomers does not necessarily mean optically active isomers. Optical isomers could be optically active as well as optically inactive, the mesoforms. Because the mesoforms are stereoisomers with some optically active isomers, and therefore they will also be counted. So total number of optical isomers, active plus inactive, is 2 to the power n, where n is the number of chiral centers. Total number of optically active isomers will be 2 to the power n. And remember, we are looking at unsymmetrical cases, no symmetry. So here the total number of racemic mixture will be obviously the optical isomers by 2. And there will be no mesoform because there is no symmetry there. So it will be 0. For example, check this out. It will be easier for you to understand this. So how many chiral centers do you have? You have 2 of them. Can you see there is no symmetry? No symmetry here at all. And total number of optical isomers is 2 to the power n, that is 4 here. And total number of optically active will also be 4. Racemic mixture will be 1 and inactive will be 0. There will be no inactive form. So total number of optically active isomers are 4, which is also equal to the total number of optical isomers. Total number of racemic mixtures will also be 2 because 4 by 2. And these are those compounds. So these are the 4 optically active compounds, and these 2 are one pair of racemic mixture, these 2 are another pair of racemic mixture, and there is no inactive form. Now let's look at symmetry. Case 2, symmetry is present in at least one stereoisomer. Now here, if it is even, if the chiral centers are even, then the total number of optical isomers active plus inactive, and that is inactive if only one is meso. Then it is 2 to the power n minus 1 plus 2 to the power n by 2 minus 1. Remember, this is when chiral centers are even and symmetry exists. Total number of optically active will be 2 to the power n minus 1. The inactive ones will be 2 to the power n by 2 minus 1. And the racemic will be the optically active by 2. So let's look out an example. Now can you see symmetry here? There is symmetry and it is even. Chiral centers are even. There are 2 of them. So 2 chiral centers. Total number of optically active isomers 2 to the power 2 minus 1, that is 2. Total number of racemic mixtures will be 1. And total number of inactive will be 1. Check this out. Total number of optical isomers will be equal to 3. So it will be these 3. This is optically active, it's enantiomer, and this is the mesoform. And they are all optical isomers. These are enantiomers. These are optically active, this is optically inactive, but they are all counted towards optical isomers. And if there are more than one mesoform, we generally take only one of them here. So let's take another example. Remember, we need even number of chiral ones. So 1, 2, 3, 4 chiral ones. Total number of optically active isomers is 8 based on the formula. And which are those 8? I'm going to show you all the 8 now. This is optically active 1. Its corresponding enantiomer. What I've basically done is I've kept the last one on the left and the first 3 on the right. And then I've drawn the mirror image. Now what I'll do is I'll keep this on right and then I change this one as left. So the next optically active is this and its corresponding enantiomer. Now remember, changing these 2 carbons or these 2 carbons is the same thing. Because remember, there is symmetry here. Remember, we're looking at symmetrical ones. So you can't change the top one and keep everything here, because changing the top one or the bottom one is the same. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the first and the second to the left. And just keep looking at these. There is no symmetry element here. There's no plane of symmetry. You can pause the video and check if you want. So now what I'm going to do is, in the first one, I kept the lowest one on the left. Then I kept the second one from the down on the left. Then I kept the first two on the left. Now I'm going to keep the alternate on one side. But remember, I have to make sure there is no plane of symmetry. So this is the seventh compound, optically active. And this is its corresponding enantiomer. Remember, there is no plane of symmetry. Just check this out. So total number of optically active isomers were 8. Now the total number of mesoforms are 2. The inactive ones, based on the formula. Which are those two? 1 and 2. So if mesoforms are more than 1, then the number of optical isomers will be the sum of optically active plus 1. You will not count both of them. You see, what you need to understand is that we had 8 optically active and 2 optically inactive. Now out of the 2, these are mesoforms. One of them and the 8 are optical isomers. Or the other one and these 8 are optical isomers. So if I ever ask you optical isomers, they are only 9. Total stereoisomers are 10. But the optical isomers are only 9 because either it will be 8 plus meso 1 or 8 plus meso 2. Both mesos together or towards each other are not optical isomers because none of them have optical activity. So how can we use the word optical? The mesoforms, since they are not optical isomers because they are not optically active, at least one of them has to be optically active. So you have only 9 optical isomers. You could either choose meso 1 for that or meso 2 for that. So total number of optical isomers, active plus inactive, is 9. If number of chiral centers is odd, remember the first one we did was even. Now we'll look for odd. Then the total number of optical isomers, active plus inactive, and we are assuming only one meso, 2 to the power n minus 1. Total number of optically active isomers would be whatever. Total number of optically inactive isomers and total number of racemic mixtures. Now again, the moment you see all the formula, you're going to feel your shoulder is going to go down and you say, do I have to remember all of this? Oh, if you want to score marks, score them fast, spend less time per question, make more effort in learning the formula. Or else spend your time in drawing all the stereoisomers, try to use logic. Not that it won't work, it will only take more time. Now if you ask me, do you remember all the formulae? No. Because I don't need to. I'm not going to give an exam. All I have to do is look at a sheet of paper and give you the formula. So I don't need to remember it. You need to remember it because you're giving an exam. Exams by definition have a time limit. So you want to do more questions in a given amount of time, you got to do them fast. So if you remember the formula, it comes very, very easy. Yes, it is tedious. Yes, you have to work. Remember, the more you work before the exam, less work you need to do in the exam and get a better result. And I think logically that makes some sense. So let's apply this. Let's take example, odd number. Now remember, we did this, when we did pseudo-chiral. I told you this is actually not chiral because on either side you have similar groups. It becomes a pseudo-chiral when one is R and the other is S. But when you look at this, you don't have to bother. When you use the formula, you don't have to bother whether it is pseudo-chiral or not. Treat it as chiral and it will help you. So total number of optically active using the formula. There are three chirals. This is the formula. And see what happens. 2. And these will be these 2. Total number of inactive forms. Simply use the formula. 2. These are the 2 meso ones. And look at the plane of symmetry in both. There's a plane of symmetry here. There's a plane of symmetry here. They're both mesoforms. But remember, when we calculate optical isomers, the active plus inactive if only one is meso. So total number of optical isomers will be 3 and not 4 because we'll count only one meso. Now let's look at one more case, that is rigid chiral centers, and these are a little cumbersome to understand. When two or more chiral centers are linked in a manner that they cannot independently assume any configuration, they are called rigid chiral centers. So what this means is that the two chiral centers are attached in such a way that independently they cannot take anything. Otherwise, if you have two chiral centers and they are flexible ones, the normal ones that we have seen open chain, they can both assume R. One can assume R, the other can be S, both can be S. And the one that was R could be S and the one that was S could be R. It could be any combination. But in rigid chiral centers, you can't have that. There are only certain configurations possible because the configuration of one is linked with the configuration of the other. And we'll talk about that. So these are the bridgehead chiral centers in polycyclic compounds. These chiral centers can only have specific configurations as they cannot independently adopt all possible configurations. Let's take an example. This question was there in JEE Advanced, and you notice there are two chiral centers here in the bridgehead. Chiral carbon, chiral carbon. Green I'm going to denote as rigid. Now, though theoretically each chiral carbon can have two configurations, R and S, since they are connected to each other in a bicyclosystem, they cannot independently take up all possible configurations. For the sake of argument, if in the above both are R, then in the enantiomer both will be S. So if this is R and this is R, obviously actually if this is R, this will be S, but let's assume both are R, then in the enantiomer both will be S. But for this to be R and this to be S, this is not possible. If this is R and this is R, if this, then this will be S, this will be S. If this is R and this has to be S, this has to turn. This bond has to come here. But how can this come here and this remain R? Because if this combination makes it R, if this becomes on this side, this will automatically change. So these two are not independent. To make one have R and the other S, the ring will have to turn in such a way that one's chiral carbon flips while the other one doesn't. This is not possible as they are connected by a ring and are bridgeheads, which means they cannot even become planar. They cannot twist. So both will flip together, restricting the possible configurational permutations. Let's take some more examples. Let's take even this one. The actual configuration of this is, for the sake of argument, let's assume that one of them is R and the other is S. Obviously, they are not similar chiral carbons, so there is no question of mesoform. Its enantiomer will be the mirror image and it will flip. So the R will become S and the S will become R. But you cannot have both of them as R. You cannot have both of them as S. One cannot flip and the other non-flip. So there are only two optical isomers instead of 4, which is a problem. So you cannot use formula here. Look at this one. There are two rigid ones. These are rigid. But there is one flexible also. This guy can take any form because the OH can be here and the H is here, or the H can be here and the OH can be here. So this can take any form. It is not restricted by these. So if suppose this is R and this is S, so I have R. So sorry, if let's assume this is R and this is R, then this can take either R or S. So let's take one combination, R as R, and in the mirror image these two will become S, but this will remain R. And then the first and the rigid ones are R, but the flexible can take R, and the rigid ones will become S. The middle one can also become S. So you have 4 cases. So you have 4 instead of 8. Now look at this weird molecule. This is basically a 6-membered ring, and there are polycyclic things. These are the two bridgeheads. This is also a bridgehead. Now they are all rigid. But these two are chiral centers. This is not, because for this part of the group and this part of the group is same. So this is rigid, this is rigid. So it has got two rigid chiral centers, but it is optically inactive. Why? There is a plane of symmetry. If you can see the plane that will cut here, cut through here, and then cut through this bond. You can just imagine that. Just cut it from here, a plane, and pass it through this plane, and this entire line will get cut into half, and the ring will get cut like this. So there's a plane of symmetry. So this guy is inactive. So this is called adamantane. So if I were to change some groups in it, what do you think? Guess. Two rigid chiral centers, but again plane of symmetry, because that plane is going to cut the Cl into half. The Cl into half. But if I change the Cl with an F, and I change the Br and the two Brs also, then obviously you have four rigid centers. 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 rigid centers. But there are only two optical isomers, because remember, this and its mirror image. That's it. They cannot take any other independent values. Both, if both are R, both will be S. That's it. Now look at this situation. Oh wow. So first find out how many rigid ones you have. Rigid are green ones. 1, 2, 3, and 4. All the halogens are rigid. But the OH and the Me ones are 4 rigid centers. OH and the Me ones are flexible. The flexible can take any form. So the entire rigid ones will give you only 2. But these two themselves will have 2 of their own and 2 of their own. So 2 from all the rigid ones, 2 from the Me, 2 from the OH. That makes it 8. And lastly, let's talk about enantiomeric excess. Again, you'll get questions on this percentage enantiomeric excess. So let us consider a mixture of two enantiomers such that the R form is 0.3 mole and the S form is 0.7 mole. Then the percentage racemic mixture is defined as the number of mole of racemic mixture upon total number of mole. Now 0.3 is R, 0.7 is S. So how much is racemic? Out of this, if you take 0.3 S, and 0.3 S and 0.3 R make racemic, right? So that is 0.6. So how much of racemic? 0.6. What is the total? 1. So that is 60%. The percentage enantiomeric excess is defined as 100 minus percentage racemic mixture, which is 40. Or you can say that amount of excess form, excess number of mole of enantiomer upon total. Now out of this 0.3 and this 0.7, 0.3 and 0.3 will make racemic. 0.4 is in excess, right? So 0.4 out of 1 mole is in excess. So that would be 40%. So that brings us to the end of this part. So I hope this part was clear to you. Watch it as many times as you need. And take your time in doing the questions. Try to do the questions on your own. Pause the video and then do it on your own. And I hope things were clear in this. And in the next one, as I said in the last video also, but this time I'm going to be making sure that we start with conformational isomers in the next one. So till then, goodbye, have a nice day, and thanks for watching this.